I'm Amy Morgan, the feature writer with the Marriage Initiative, and I am just delighted to introduce Reverend Dave Harvey to you today. Dave's the president of the Great Commission Collective, in charge of church planning, church care, and international outreach, a position that allows him to travel across the world, teaching pastors and missionaries. His first marriage book, When Sinners Say I Do, has been translated into Spanish, Portuguese, German, Romanian, and Hebrew, followed in 2020 by I Still Do, growing closer and stronger through life's defining moments. A graduate of Westminster Theological Seminary, Dave presently serves on the board for the Christian Counseling and Educational Foundation and founded amicalled.com. He's also served as general editor for the Sojourn Network's How To series and contributes regularly at the Gospel Coalition, Desiring God, and for the Church. Dave, thank you so much for being here.
Amy, it's great to be with you.
Well, you have such an interesting background in church planning and missionary work. How did you get started in the marriage space?
Well, I started in the marriage space by getting married, and Kim and I just started stumbling forward together, and we've been married now for 41 years as of last month.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was also a pastor for 33 years, and in my role as a pastor, I had the privilege of sitting with folks and preaching and just being able to think about the challenges and problems that confront us as we're trying to live with one another in marriage. And so I think with respect to the book, I think what happened was I gave a message many years ago that was titled "When Sinners Say I Do," and one of the things that I noticed, Amy, was that a lot of believers were losing sight of sin as the primary problem we encounter in the context of marriage. It's not the exclusive problem. It's not the only problem, but for the overwhelming majority of us, it is the primary problem. And more folks were losing sight of that. And so yeah, I was at a conference. I delivered this message titled "When Sinners Say I Do," and that message kind of had, I think I mentioned to you when we talked once, that it had a disproportionate resonance.
Yeah.
Because I was asked to give it a number of times then. And I've just began to ponder, I wonder if there's a book in here somewhere. And so it wasn't immediate. It was about 12, 13 years later that I wrote the book.
Well, and when it first came out, kind of in the mid 2000s, with your international work, it became a real catalyst. I mean, as you were going internationally and speaking and, doing your church planting and that, there weren't that many resources back then. And it really kind of took off, which is why it's been translated into so many languages. I know you shared that you were in, it wasn't Peru, Brazil, right? Mm-hmm. And you were shocked that was a sellout crowd and people waiting to talk to you.
Yeah, well, I'm always surprised when people are waiting to talk to me. But yeah, there was an unusual amount of folks. And I think in part it was because I was told later, because I asked one of our hosts, wow, how am I supposed to account for that? And he said, oh, well, the book is circulated in an amazing way around Brazil here. And it's incited a lot of interest and helped a lot of people. And I was really grateful to hear that. But Amy, I think part of it is that it kind of landed in a space where, while there was a lot written on writing, there wasn't a lot of stuff that was unpacking the importance of understanding the sinfulness of sin and how sin can undermine our goals in marriage and undermine our relationship and our unity in marriage. And so I think that in some ways it was landing in a space that was underserved.
Yeah, well, just in the short time that I've had to get to know you and talk with you, you have such a thoughtful and scripturally based just a real theological application to your writing that is so special. And I think that our marriage champions, for whom that's their bent, will really find great application in your work, and really look forward to your resources. So one of the things that you talked about, I know that when Sinners Say I Do kind of applies maybe more to the newlywed space, the young marrieds, other than I know there is a chapter in there that is more about broken marriages. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more before we talk about your newer resource?
Well, I think that when Sinners Say I Do assumes that all marriages are broken in some way because of the way that sin breaks us up, because the way sin operates in our hearts, and that part of what we're called to do from the outset is to recognize that marriage is two people with their sin coming together, and should have the assumption that that sin is going to surface. So that part of God's intention is to be able to learn about one another, love one another, challenge one another, but also recognize that God has called us to be merciful toward one another, and that sin surfacing and seeing each other for who we really are is all part of being married, and it's all part of helping one another. And because really you're called to a journey of not simply starting strong together, but ending well together.
I'm so glad that you brought up ending well, because that last chapter does address a long-term marriage and helping your spouse finish well. And that is, again, is a real underserved area. Could you go into that a little more? It really resonated with me losing my mother last year.
Yeah, well, one of the things that happened was, as I was thinking about the book, at the same time, my father was dying of cancer, and he was in hospice care toward the end, and my mom was taking care of him. And my dad loved my mother, and my dad was he was a steel worker, he was a veteran, he was a man of duty, and he would not. My mom knew he would not give up life easily. He would not give up on his wife easily, and so he was, while he was, growing unconscious and he wasn't conversing anymore, she could tell he was struggling. And so as he was declining and no longer conscious, I had this vivid memory of my mom, like just speaking, whispering down in his ear, because I was sitting over on the couch, and his bed was like in the middle of the room, and she was just saying, run to Jesus, honey, run to Jesus. He's going to take care of me as well. And I'm sitting there as a relatively young man, been married at that point a few years, and I'm thinking about this, and I'm saying to myself, I think I'm seeing and understanding something profound about marriage in this very moment. That this is a picture of one of the points of marriage. It's not only helping each other live well, but it's helping each other die well. It's delivering your spouse into the hands of Jesus.
Wow. And that brings back such vivid memories of my own mom's passing. But again, that's an area that most people don't talk about and don't even think about, is that is a role of a spouse to help your spouse pass. And you talk about that in the I Still Do, about defining moments, especially for those of us with more mature marriages, that those things come up. And let's transition to how that happens.
Yeah. So when Sinners Say I Do was out, and it was, as time passed, I realized it was providing service for premarital and then newlyweds. And then also I was hearing a lot that it would be referred to couples that were in crisis over one thing or the other. But I realized that there was this wide open space that didn't seem to have a lot written in it of for couples that were married like 7 to 10 years. In other words, they had crossed the threshold of those first few years, where marriages can often break up in the 3 to 7 year range. They'd crossed those thresholds. They knew they wanted to run the race together. So what were the defining moments that they could expect to encounter?
Yeah.
as they ran forward together. And I just began reflecting on, the 4 decades that Kim and I had been married. There was probably 37 years by then. And just what were the defining moments for us? And then summarized those into 11 defining moments, and wrote what effectively became a companion volume to When Sinners Say I Do, titled I Still Do, built around those 11 defining moments.
And you do have a couples guide that goes with that as well. There's the book, correct? And then another resource that kind of partners with it.
Yeah, there's a devotional and then a study guide too for couples and small groups.
Well, you start the chapter 2, which again, Marriage Champions is available at no charge on Dave's website, ReverendDaveHarvey.com. That whole second chapter is there. Can you explain that? Because you said the problem was sin was not the only problem in a marriage, that there were these other things, these other defining moments. And you had a really cool diagram about explaining the different things that can impact a marriage. And you provide that for anyone who is interested in seeing it. So can you explain it to us?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up because, the first book that I wrote, When Sinners Say I Do, it was about unpacking sinfulness. But I wanted to start this book by saying, while sin is a problem, one of the defining moments you encounter in marriage is recognizing that, yeah, sin is a problem, but it's not the only problem. And so that chapter is built around when you discover brokenness is broader than sin. And I talk about being in a room where David Pallison, who was the executive director of the Christian Counseling and Educational Foundation, was there, and a small group of people, and someone asked him, so can you help me to understand, what makes a person, what motivates them? And so he kind of was energized by the question and stood up, and he drew a circle in the middle of the board, and he wrote the human heart. And he began to describe how Scripture centers our motivation on who we really are in the human heart. That out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and began pulling all of these passages to kind of center the heart and say that we have to understand the human heart if we're going to understand personhood. But then he said, so often that's where people's understanding of humanness or of personhood, it stops there.
Yeah.
But Christians have to also understand that heart is embodied. And so he drew a second circle around that, and he began to describe the reality of being an embodied soul, and that we're deeply affected by things that affect our bodies, that it affects our soul, that while you're in this world, they're inextricably bound. And so I just know, like for me, like I'll go home sometimes at 5 o'clock, and our grandson will be running around, and maybe dinner won't be on the table for another 2.5 hours. And the kind of attitudes and thoughts that can be springing from my mind simply because I'm hungry,
Yeah.
there's just no doubt that there is some kind of connection between the two. But a lot of Christians don't even think about the idea of embodiment and how the soul is affected by what happens to the body. So I'm sitting there, and he's talking about this, and I'm thinking, wow, that's really good. And he says, but that's not all. And he draws a third circle and talks about how that embodied soul is also embedded in social systems. You had an abusive father, or you grew up in poverty, or maybe flip that around. Maybe you had two parents that just loved you. And well, the point is that we are shaped significantly by our past, by our upbringing, that we don't need to think about those things as causal, but they are significant to who we become. And so he's talking about this, and I'm thinking, I'm sitting there like as a biblical counselor, you just think, wow, this is like blowing categories for me. And then he says, but that's not all. And he draws a fourth circle, and he says that person is also embattled by, the dark world.
Yeah.
And he starts talking about, the reality of demons. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, and Satan is a lion prowling around seeking whom we may devour. He's saying we've got to wrestle with this. If we're going to define personhood according to Scripture, then we have to bring these passages into play. And then it was so fascinating, Amy, because at the final, in the final moment, he drew a fifth circle and he wrote over it, God of Providence. And he said, all of these circles are in play and the human heart is at the center, but they're all operating under and within the providence of God. So you can have Joseph, for instance, who is,
Yeah.
has an enabling father, and his brothers despise him. They're going to murder him, but they think, no, we're not going to murder him. Actually, we're just going to sell him into slavery, where they put him in a position where he's exiled for the rest of his life. He's the object of a sexual predator. He's
Yeah.
falsely imprisoned. He's unjustly accused. He ends up having all of these, horrible things happen. Fast forward to the end of the story in Genesis chapter 50. How does he interpret it? You meant it for evil.
God meant it for
God meant it for good. That circle of providence, just all the things that happened to Joseph. So, I'm sitting there and I'm watching all that and I'm thinking, wow, I think this is like a defining moment in my life, because this changes everything. This will impact my marriage, my parenting, my counseling, my pastoring, how I do friendships, how I approach people. You come from the outside in to get to know somebody. You don't assume that you just jump into the heart. No,
Yeah.
you earn the opportunity by passing through those circles, moving inward toward the human heart.
Well, that is just so interesting. And I know that there are marriage champions that are like, their eyes are lighting up just like yours as you describe it, and just like yours when you heard it. And truly, that diagram would be so helpful. So they can go to your website and they can see it right there and they could explain that. Let's talk a little bit more about how then that applies in the defining moments, because that's what we're talking about, the defining moments in marriage, different kind of Rubicons, things that happen. Being married for 28 years myself, I know I've seen some of those too.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that jumps to mind, Amy, is one of the moments is the moment of weakness. In other words, there's a whole category that scripture has for who we are that is not about sin. It's not about, like the ways that we fall short of God's law. It's built into the fact that we're not God. We're not omniscient and omnipotent and omnicompetent. We're fallen and we fail and we can't see the future, and so we make mistakes. There's, it's the lights left on, it's the doors left open, it's the dented fender, it's the areas where we're weak, and that we're called in marriage to be patient with each other and to help the weak, and that we have to find a place where we not only understand each other's weaknesses, but we don't use those weaknesses against each other. On the contrary, we bring mercy into play, and we have mercy for one another in these areas of weakness, because mercy says that I'm not ever going to withdraw from you because of an area of weakness. My love for you is not conditional upon your improvement in these areas of weakness. Now, again, we're not talking about sin here. We're talking about the fact that your spouse is not God.
Yes.
And you're marrying an imperfect person. And so often those weaknesses are places where, we just pound one another. We prosecute one another because of weaknesses. And so that's one of the ways that we realize that our brokenness is broader than sin, is that we're not strong, we're weak.
Well, and you mentioned mercy, and that's another one of your defining moments, when you get mercy.
Yeah. I think what mercy does is mercy introduces ministry as a primary goal for marriage.
Hmm.
And when I say ministry, I'm not talking about like preaching at one another. I'm talking about the tender loving care of another sinner, because mercy specifically has to do with how God related to us as
Yes.
we sinned against him,
Hmm.
and how he was loving and tender and forbearing and forgiving, despite the fact that we were oppositional and hostile and rebelling against him.
While
And
we were
so,
yet sinners,
yeah, that's right. And so scripture calls us in Luke chapter 6 to be merciful, even as our Father is merciful. And the hardest place for that to happen, but the first place it should happen, is in the context of marriage.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you have several items, seven defining moments that kind of apply to those of us in mature marriages, marriages that have been around for a while. When dreams disappoint, when the kids leave.
Yeah, and when you discover sex changes with age, these are huge things that when you learn closure is overrated. These are things that happen as you're moving and journeying forward in life together, and you're crossing the threshold of 2 decades and 25 years and 30 years, and these monumental changes are taking place in life that oftentimes, can surprise you by the divisive effect they could have, because there's a sense where we think that, man, we get into marriage, we just start logging the time and the effort in the front half, and then we can coast on what we've built.
Yeah.
But there are some assaults that take place along the way where you have to continue. I mean, marriage is set up so that you have to fight for it until the day you die. And that's why the defining moments became so important.
Yeah. Well, and my friends and I, we're all at that 25 to 30 year mark or in there. And we're talking about, how we become empty nesters and how we move forward intentionally, just like you're saying, how we, like it said, kind of, we didn't really think about fighting, but we thought about how we're being intentional to grow closer now that our time is not, taken up
Yeah.
by running to soccer practice or football games or those types of things. How,
Yeah.
when the evenings are long, what do you do? How are you
Yeah.
intentional?
A lot of couples, Amy, don't realize how much the children prop them up,
Yeah.
or glue them together, or buffer,
Yeah.
some of the issues between them and their spouse, and the kids leave. Like I know a guy who, kids left, and the marriage blew apart, and they realized that, wow, all along we thought we were united and together as a family, and they realized as they unpacked it all, no, we were actually built around the children and keeping the children moving forward, and we weren't really investing intentionally in the marriage. And by the grace of God, they were able to they separated, they worked on it, they confess their sins to each other, to God, and they're reunited and better than ever now. But had that very experience that we're talking about, they were more child-centered than they were ever aware.
Yeah. The last chapter, that when you learn closure is overrated. Again, I think maybe this came from all your international travels. You see, different worldviews and different things. And you said closures are real. It's a very American kind of a thought, an expectation. Could you unpack that for our marriage champions? Because when you and I talked about it, it wasn't something I'd heard before, but it sure rang true.
Well, I think as you grow older, Amy, you can nurture a dream that God exists to close the loop
Yeah.
on all of the open-ended things in our life, and that's kind of the arrangement that we have with God.
Yeah.
If we're faithful, if we're obedient, then the broken relationship that we have over here, or the disappointed dream that we have over there, is all going to be resolved if we just wait. God will deliver if we just wait. Yet in a fallen world where there's brokenness, even when you do things right, things can still go wrong.
Yeah.
So, maybe you were the diligent spouse, but the marriage still imploded, or you poured the best you have into your kids, or that one child, and they still went rogue. They're not following Christ. They're more in the prodigal category. I think that those kinds of things, those disappointments, on the difference between what they expected Christianity to be and what it really is, those are the places where people can bankrupt. That's where people deconstruct, is
Yeah.
in those disappointed places. And ultimately, the Spirit will come and coax us forward, but we have to land back on the idea that God's wisdom should be trusted. His timing should be trusted. His providence in our life should be trusted, because if not, then we can live life craving closure. And when you crave closure and you don't get closure, then you become captive to closure, and you become imprisoned by closure, and you can feel defrauded by God, because God didn't write the story in the way that you expected. And yet to be a believer, to be a Christian is we don't realize this all the time. In fact, most of the time we don't realize it when we're being converted. But to be a Christian is not to sign up for a certain version of your life, the version that you want. It's to trust God with the version that He has planned.
Yeah, but sometimes, man, and I think too in America, we're just so used to thinking of God's the magic genie in the sky, and hope deferred makes the heart sick, and people kind of expect this resolution, and then but you kind of counter that with it. The Apostle Paul's words in Timothy, didn't you say?
Well, yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the American thing as well, because I do think there is a sense where our affluence and our orientation makes us assume that we can move things along, that leadership can deliver, that we can purchase the answer to our and solutions to our problems. We're more oriented that way. But yeah, I in the book I get into Second Timothy and how that's the last epistle that Paul ever wrote, and you expect it to be a swan song. You expect it to be just this big wonderful goodbye, because it's the end of, more toward the end of Paul's life, and yet it's just this list of defections and departures and desertions and disappointments. And like in chapter 1 he says all of Asia has left me, and then he gets real specific, Phygelus and Hermogenes and Hymenaeus and Philetus and Demas, remember him? Oh, well, he's went back into the world. And Alexander, Alexander the coppersmith. Oh, he did me wrong too. And then he, in the final chapter, in chapter 4, some of the final words that Paul wrote at my first defense, no one stood by me, everyone deserted me, but the Lord stood at my side. So just that sense that, this is not the way you expected an apostle's life to end.
Yeah.
And because we all think that, okay, so we're sowing into relationships now, we're sowing into community, we're sowing into our churches. And that means that what life should look like in our 50s, 60s, and 70s is we're surrounded by our family, we're surrounded by the church. And for some people, it is that way. And I'm grateful to God, but I'm trying to get help for the people that it doesn't work out that way, to say, hey, if it doesn't work out that way, you've got good company. The Apostle Paul is standing there as well.
And Marriage Champions, this is so interesting about that closure. And there are more resources that Dave has at his website, including a podcast describing how he counsels in the area of emotional abuse, which is a concern that has come out. And you've been on the board for the Christian Counseling and Educational Foundation. You have a very thoughtful voice for people in that space, learning how to navigate the problem. Do you want to just go into that just for another minute or two? Because I'm sure our Marriage Champions have come across that in the past.
Well, I want to tell you about one thing that is really a burden for me. And that is about 6 months ago, I started a blog on the RevDaveHarvey.com site that's titled Tenacious Tuesday. And Amy, it's actually on ambition and resilience.
Yeah.
Because I have this growing concern, particularly over the past 3 years, of how everything has affected people and how it's impacted this concept of our dreams and our determination, and the way the church can relate to ambition. So there's like a diminishing of ambition, but then when ambition does surface, sometimes the church doesn't really know what to do with that, because it can be stigmatized, because we misunderstand ambition and label it all as if it's wrong. or it's misguided, or it's selfish. And yet, without ambition, churches aren't planted. Without ambition, businesses aren't started, and books aren't written. And without ambition, civilizations become lazy. And
Wow.
so there's a lot that's dependent upon us stirring up and inciting a good, godly ambition. And so I started a blog that is delivered into your inbox every Tuesday. And all person has to do is go to the Rev Dave Harvey, the REV DaveHarvey.com site, and you can subscribe to the blog and check out the other free stuff that's on there as well.
I just love that. I love that idea of resilience. I think that's something that is really needed to be addressed and thought about in a thoughtful way, which you do so much in our culture now. So, oh gosh, Dave, thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate the interview.
Oh, and as always, Marriage Champions, if you'd like more information about Dave and his resources, you can find us at marriageinitiative.org.